Hello everyone, welcome to the BOOKphilic YouTube channel. Now in this video we are going to understand the RMD 1 and RMD 2. So what does it mean? RMD basically means rightmost derivation in case of grammar of the compiler design. So basically we have discussed already the LMD and RMD ways techniques to derive our production rule in the grammar. Okay, so it was discussed in our previous lecture, which is given by a simple example. Okay, so it was our previous lecture about the ambiguity of grammar. So we have discussed in our previous video that a grammar will be said to be ambiguous if and only if either of these three conditions will be followed. That is, more than one LMD is formed, more than one RMD is formed, and more than one parse tree can be generated from a given input string. So in our previous lecture, we have taken our one example: E derives capital E plus capital E or capital E star capital E or ID. Okay, where ID is nothing but the terminals and capital E is nothing but the non-terminals. And here the E is nothing but the start symbol. So let us understand. So basically in our previous lecture we have just derived LMD and RMD and their respective parse string in order to say that this grammar is said to be ambiguous. But can we do in another way also? Yes, we can. So in our this video we will be discussing more than one RMD which can be formed. So let us start with RMD 1 and RMD 2. Later on we will be discussing more than one LMD, and we will say and we will prove that this grammar is known as ambiguous grammar. So let us start. Okay, so first of all, RMD1. So as by name it is suggesting that RMD means rightmost derivation. You have to take the rightmost non-terminal, that is capital E. So it will start from the right and will end up to left. So let us start. So this was our previous rules of grammar. So we have just taken E plus E, and in this case we have taken E star E. Yes, you are listening to me right. Whenever you will be given a rules of grammar, a production rule, you will have to take one rule in one case and another rule in another case. Then only you can derive the same syntax with using two different ways. So our main target is to derive the same syntax. Then only we can say that this grammar is ambiguous, because the same syntax can be derived in two different ways. So let us start with the first RMD1. So that here it is. E derives capital E plus E star E. So what we have done basically is that this capital E, that is the rightmost capital E, has been derived into E star E. Can we? Yes, we can, because in our example we have taken E derives capital E plus capital E or capital E star capital E or ID. So for your understanding, I am just writing the same example here so that you can understand what was our production rule. Okay, so it was given there capital E, capital E. Okay, let us write here capital E derives capital E plus capital E or capital E star capital E. Star is nothing but multiplication sign, or ID. ID is nothing but our identifier, or you can say it is a terminal which cannot be further derived. Okay, so in this case we can write the same production rule in this way. Okay, so let me write again. So capital E derives capital E plus capital E, and in the next line we will have to write capital E derives capital E star capital E, and in the next line we will be writing capital E derives ID. So these can be written from this given production rule of grammar. Okay, So you can understand that first of all we have written capital E derives capital E plus capital E. Then we have written capital E derives capital E star capital E. Then at last we have written capital E derives ID. So basically this is standing, this is the symbol of or, this is the symbol of or. Either this capital E can be derived into capital E star capital E or capital E plus capital E or ID. So in this way we are going to understand this RMD and RMD2 process. Okay, so what we have done in our previous example, that capital E has been derived into capital E star capital E. So this is the final. So ultimately we have gotten our given string input, that is ID plus ID star ID. Now you can understand that all capital E must be derived into ID, so that we can ultimately get this capital E derives ID plus ID star ID. But we cannot derive at once, we have to derive one by one. So for that we are deriving the rightmost capital E, that is the non-terminal, into ID, that is the terminal. And at last we will be deriving this capital E into its ID, and at last we will be deriving this capital E into ID. So in this way we have derived the syntax ID plus ID star ID. So in this way we have done it. Okay, but what about this RMD2? So we will again try to evaluate the same syntax using another rules of grammar, that is capital E derives capital E star capital E. So first of all we have to take the rightmost capital E. So here we have to derive it directly into ID. Why? Because in our given syntax here the star is at last position. That's why star must be at last position. We cannot derive this capital E. We have to derive this left capital E into capital E plus capital E. But since it is RMD, that is right to left derivation, that's why we have to first of all derive this capital E. Then at last we will have to derive this capital E. See, that's why we have written capital E has been derived into ID. Now at last, what is the rightmost non-terminal, that is capital E. This capital E will be further on derived into capital E plus capital E. So this ID will be written as it is. Now what is the rightmost capital E, that is this capital E will be, which will be derived further on ID. Now this ID will be written as it is. Okay, now what is left now? This capital E. So this capital E will be ultimately derived into ID. So hope you have understood how this is going on. So now you can notice that we are getting the same syntax, ID plus ID star ID, and here also ID plus ID star ID. So in two different ways, that is RMD1 and RMD2, in two different ways we are getting the same syntax. So in this case parser will get confused, because the parser needs to generate the parse tree from these rules of grammar that we have derived. Okay, so the parser will get confused from which RMD1 or RMD2 should I use to generate the parse tree. That's why we have to say that this is nothing but the ambiguity property of grammar. So more than one RMD is formed, hence it is also known as ambiguous grammar. So by this property we have taken this example. Now let us understand one more thing. Okay, what we have written in our previous video, that a grammar will be said to be ambiguous when more than one RMD can be formed or more than one LMD can be formed. So we have seen that more than one RMD can be formed. Now can we prove it by using more than one LMD? Yes, we can. So let us take the same example and start deriving the LMD1 and LMD2. So by name it is suggesting that LMD is nothing but left to right derivation, and it is also left to right derivation. So now we have to take again the first production rule for LMD1 and the second production rule for our LMD2. So by name it is suggesting that from left to right we have to derive the since. That's why we have to derive this capital E at first. because it is at the leftmost side, and at last we have to derive this capital E. So what our syntax is that id plus id star id. So to get the plus symbol, at first we have to derive it directly into capital E into id, because if we are going to derive capital E into E star id, then the plus symbol will get at last position, which we want not to be happened. Okay, so we are deriving this capital E into id. Now what is going on for this capital E? So we are writing as it is, we are writing as it is. Now what is left? This capital E is left, this capital E is left. So we are going to derive it directly into id? No. If we are going to do, then we will only get the id plus id, we will not get this capital star E. So that's why we have to derive it further on. First of all, capital E into is E star E, then only we can derive this into id, their respective id. So what we have written that in our example is that in our next step we are going to derive this capital E into id, then star E as it is written, then in the next step at last this capital E will be derived into id. In this same way we have gotten the same syntax id plus id star id. So our main motive is to generate the same syntax, or else we cannot get the proper right answer. So let us take the LMD2. So in this case also we have to derive the non-terminals from left to right. So let us start with this capital E. So since we are having this star and this star must be at last position, that's why we are going to derive this capital E into capital E plus capital E. Then we will be deriving this capital E, which is at the leftmost side, into id. Then what will be left? E star E. Now what is left? This middle capital E is left, so this middle capital E will be derived into id. Okay, and what is the leftmost now? Capital E, that is a non-terminal, this is E, so we will ultimately derive into id. So ultimately we are getting the same syntax id plus id star id and id plus id star id. So we can say that in this case also parser will get confused and more than one LMD can be formed. Since more than one LMD can be formed, that's why this is known as ambiguous grammar. So in our college examination, this is mostly asked that you will be given a production rule. They suppose E derives capital E plus capital E, or capital E star capital E, or id. This is the given production rule to your examination, and you will be asked to check whether the given grammar is ambiguous or not. So in order to check, you have to derive LMD1, LMD2, and if the same syntax can be generated from two different ways, that is LMD1 and LMD2, in that case you will just write down that so more than one LMD is formed, hence it is an ambiguous grammar. So I hope you have understood how we can check the grammar is ambiguous or not. So let us move on to the LMD1 parse tree, LMD2 parse tree, because we have written in the third point that if more than one parse tree can be generated, then in that case also this will be called as ambiguous grammar. So from left to right we will be deriving the parse tree because it is a LMD1 parse tree, and from left to right here also because it is LMD2 parse tree. So from the given grammar we will be deriving the first E, that is the start symbol. That's why we have written in our definition of start symbol that start symbol is nothing but the root node of the tree, from where the tree grows, starts growing. So let us start with capital E. So ultimately we need to derive this id plus id star id. So to get this we have to derive it further on capital E plus capital E, and in the rightmost side we have to take capital E star capital E, then only we can derive it into respective id. And this capital E cannot be derived further on respective id because we have to get this star. So in order to get this star we have to derive it further on E star E. So in this case we will be deriving then E into id, then then this E will be derived into ID. So this is how we have gotten our ID plus ID star ID. So hope you have understood how this parse tree can be generated. Now in this case we are going to take another production rule, that is E star E. So we will try to evaluate the same syntax using another way. Okay, so we are going to derive this capital E because we need this plus symbol in order to generate ID plus ID star ID. That's why we are deriving this capital E into E plus E, and this capital E will be derived into ID. Now ultimately this capital E and this capital E will be derived into respective ID. So this is how we have gotten the same syntax, ID plus ID star ID. So we can say that since LMD and RMD has different parse trees, the grammar is ambiguous. Yes, we have generated two different parse tree for the same syntax of grammar, that is ID plus ID star ID. So we can say that this is nothing but the ambiguity of the grammar. So hope you have understood what is LMD1, LMD2, RMD1, RMD2, what is parse tree. So this is how we have proved that a grammar is ambiguous. Thank you.